When I hear about new mobility innovations, I'm always impressed with the ingenuity with which those ideas come from. And I'm hopeful that it can help us move towards a more sustainable paradigm for transportation. But I'm often struck by a concern that I haven't yet been able to shake. I'll take a stab at addressing it and hope that some of you will help me address it as well. The question is, if we build it, will they come? If the new mobility infrastructure is built and the doors opened, will the public change its behavior from the current transportation status quo? At first, I thought this might be a naive question, especially for a crowd like this. And surely new technologies and a desire for sustainable transportation would drive the adoption of new mobility. But when I thought about all the empty buses that drive around this city, and cities like this all over the country, I wasn't so sure. If these public transit systems, which are in their own right technological marvels, as interesting as, say, some of the most innovative ideas that are coming out right now, if those systems ran at full capacity, I wouldn't be so concerned. But many systems often run nearly empty and rely on taxpayer subsidies in order to survive. As a result, many communities that might like to have a mass transit system may turn down the opportunity since they cannot be assured that it'll sustain itself. Perhaps my initial question is a little bit too simplistic, though. So instead of asking, will they come, perhaps we should ask, why wouldn't they come? Such a question is deeply psychological and has everything to do with the choices people make based on the transportation options available to them. I'd like to focus on the notion of availability for a moment. There are at least a couple ways we can think about availability. First is the physical and social availability of transportation choices. For example, a car sitting in your garage is physically available. Similarly, living closer to the train station makes it more physically available for those residents. The cheaper the train tickets, the more affordable they are to a larger percentage of the population. When such options are available, they are more likely to be used. Making transportation physically and socially available is a common theme for many of the new mobility efforts you guys are engaged in here. But availability can also be thought about from a cognitive perspective. When information is cognitively available, it is easily retrievable from our minds. In other words, we don't need to Google it because we've already got it in our heads. For example, I know that the number 13 bus here in Ann Arbor runs every 30 minutes, and it takes me a 5-minute ride plus a 15-minute walk to get to campus. When that knowledge is cognitively within arm's reach, I'm able to use it as easily and effectively as a car sitting in my garage. However, many things are not cognitively within reach. Despite the fact that I've lived in this town for many years, I still don't feel confident about whether it's 5th or Division that runs north-south, or whether it's 4th or 5th that runs one way, so don't ask me for directions. Cognitive availability is a technical term in psychology with a significant amount of literature around it. But in simpler terms, we might equate cognitive availability simply with familiarity. What I'd like to suggest is that many of the decisions people make about transportation have just as much to do with cognitive availability or familiarity as it does with how physically and socially available it is. By and large, the old mobility, which is centered around the personal automobile, is very familiar to the public. Many Americans have spent decades interacting with and relying on the personal car. These constant interactions lead to an intimate familiarity with the ins and outs of using automobiles. We know how to drive, when and where to get gas, how to merge on the highway, and if not, we know how to use our horns. We know that red means stop and green means go. We know that we should change our oil and our tires, and if your car stops running, to call AAA. In short, there are a good number of neurons perched up there between our ears that are dedicated to our understanding of the automobile culture. By contrast, the general public's experience with the new mobility is somewhat limited. Hubs, slug lines, BRTs, EVs, these occupy much less headspace, are much less familiar, and knowledge about using them is less easily retrieved from our minds, and more importantly, from the public's minds. I don't want to generalize that people will always choose the familiar over the unfamiliar. People do flirt with the unfamiliar from time to time. For example, Many of us like to take vacations to exotic destinations. But when more familiar modes of transportation are in competition with less familiar ones, which is the case today, there is reason for concern that the public may choose the easier, more familiar option, which suggests that this lack of familiarity is an important hurdle for the new mobility to consider. Many aspects of the old mobility are familiar. We know that it often gets us quickly and comfortably from point A to point B. We know that with our own cars, we don't have to rely on others. And at least for now, it is relatively affordable. But there are familiar aspects of the old mobility that are not so desirable. For example, traffic, wasted time, road rage, endless construction, and high gas prices are but a few of the familiar aspects of the old mobility that we find undesirable. One thing to note about the column on the right is that it excludes environmental concerns. While there's little doubt that many of us here make our choices with the environment in mind, personal costs may be far more salient to the general public. What this suggests is that we have to frame the new mobility in terms of solutions to the vividly familiar and personal concerns that people have with the existing transportation system. The new mobility needs to address upfront these issues that the old paradigm has been unable to address. For example, riding the bus can relieve you of the stresses of driving during your commute. Maybe you can read or check your email with onboard Wi-Fi. Yes, it may take 30 minutes longer, but really it's only 15 minutes because you would have spent at least 15 minutes finding parking. And if it helps deal with climate change too, well, that's great. This sort of reframing in terms of personal gains instead of global costs may help promote the new mobility to a larger percentage of the population. In addition to improving on the salient shortcomings of the existing system, the new mobility is also faced with the daunting challenge of fostering familiarity where it does not exist. Helping people understand new mobility systems, where to find them, how to navigate them, how to pay for them, how to move from one system to another, and how to take advantage of its myriad offerings is by no means a straightforward task. If there's anyone out there with an iPhone app to do that, find me afterwards. Until then, here are a few ideas about fostering familiarity.